This is the fourth video in my series of video articles on how to write short stories, and in this article we're going to look at the 6 short story types that science fiction author Damon identified. Now, this is an overview video, and what we're going to look at is the 6 short story types. These short story types are the resolution short story, the revelation short story, a decision short story, explanation short story, solution short story, and the unplotted / illumination short story. We're just briefly going to overview each of these today, and then the next series of video articles, there will be one for each of the short story types, going into more detail in them. Plus, later on in the series, when we've covered plot structures, there is a plot structure that I'm favouring at this point in time, and there'll be a second mini-series where we apply that plot structure to each of these short story types. Now, I said that the short story types were identified by Damon. His book, Creating Short Fiction, is, in my opinion, the best book that you can find on writing short stories. Ignore the fact that he's a science fiction writer. He talks about writing in general, uses lots of examples that are outside the science fiction genre, so it's not a book for science fiction writers. I don't know if you can read, but on the cover there's a blurb from Harlan Ellison, a guy who you should know and read, a really interesting speculative fiction short story writer, and his blurb reads, "To those who hunger to be writers, I commend this book without reservation." That's a pretty glowing recommendation from a guy who is highly thought of as a short story writer. So let's look at the first short story type, which is the resolution story. This story has a 5-part structure, and as I said, there'll be a video article solely devoted to this story structure and each of the story structures, and we'll go into that structure in that video. The story is based on character growth or character efforts, and they provide the fuel for the story engine. Because of this, the resolution story does create a strong sense of reader identification with the protagonist, because the story is based around the character's efforts, his try-fail cycles, to get to a goal and resolve the central story that is at the heart of the story. That makes it ideal for commercial fiction, which could be horror, mystery, science fiction, that kind of stuff. And a film example is Rocky. This has a resolution story. I'm using film examples because most of you will be familiar with the films I mention, but there will, if I mention some of the short stories that serve as examples, we've all got very different tastes in short stories, and I might recommend 5 or 6 stories that you've never read, never even heard of perhaps. While that be a good thing for finding stories for you to go and read, for the purposes of teaching, sometimes using film examples is better, because we all have a much more common story base from films, because we've all seen similar types of films. Anyway, let's move on to number 2, which is the revelation story. Now, the revelation story centers on disclosure of information that's revealed throughout the story, and then the story itself will conclude with a significant revelation at the end. The plot is driven by mystery and curiosity rather than conflict, which is not to say you can't have conflict, but it's creating those story questions that makes the reader go, what does that mean? How was that going to play out? How will that affect the character? 2 examples. One is a short story, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, often hailed as one of the top 20 short stories of the 20th century. Very simple story in a way, but very powerful. You should definitely check that story out. And then I've got a film example, and that film example is Fight Club. And if you've seen Fight Club, you know what the revelation is in the end. And if you go back and watch it knowing that, you'll see the story very differently than the first time you actually watched it. The third type of story that Knight identified is the decision story. The decision story centers on a character facing a difficult or impossible choice. The story concludes when the character makes that decision, and the plot is driven by the internal conflict of which decision is the character going to make and why. And the resolution at the end should show or suggest the consequences of the decisions made by the character, which choice he went for or she went for, and that then reveals something deep and true about the character's values and who they are as a person. The classic film example for this is Sophie's Choice. If you've not seen this, the central character is played by Meryl Streep, and she is a mother who has to choose which of her two children dies. She can save one, the other one has to die, and then she has to live with the guilt, etc., of making that choice, even though she saved one of her children. The explanation story is the fourth type that Knight identified, and this story type centers on explaining mysterious events or circumstances. The story creates ongoing curiosity with unexplained events and happenings, and though there are clues that point towards understanding what's happening, it's not till the climax where there's an explanation that completes the story and makes sense of everything. And the classic example of this is the Bruce Willis film The Sixth Sense. So if you've seen that, that will illuminate the explanation story and make the concept of the explanation story make a little bit more sense to you. The fifth type that Knight identified is the solution story, and the solution story centers on a seemingly insolvable problem. You get clues and hints as the reader that you can use to try and work out what the solution's going to be, but the story usually resolves with an unexpected, clever or elegant solution that still plays fair with story logic. And a couple of film examples, Ocean's 11 and The Prestige. Didn't like Ocean's 11 particularly, thought The Prestige was a fabulous film. So depending on your film preferences, your film genre preferences, maybe check out The Prestige. I thought that was, although it was reasonably well liked, and I think it's an undervalued film. I thought it was a great film. The final story type, which I'm not going to talk about much, because it's more of a literary story type and I'm more interested in commercial fiction. It's the unplotted story, and the unplotted story focuses on character or condition rather than dramatic structure. As I said, it's often found in more literary short stories. The meaning of the story often emerges from accumulated insights rather than dramatic action in terms of plot events or things that happen in the plot of the short story. And a couple of film examples, Lost in Translation and My Dinner with Andre. If you've seen both of those films, that will give you an idea of what the unplotted story genre is about. And unplotted is perhaps not a great word for it. Knight also used the term illumination story, and I think that's a better term to use for this kind of story. There was a caveat that Damon Knight gave with when he was talking about these 6 story types and after identifying them, and that caveat was that each of the story types is a pure example, but it's entirely possible to have stories that blend 2 or more of these story types. And Knight himself uses Dashiell Hamnett's story The Maltese Falcon as an example of a story that blended 3 story types. Knight said, "Good writers keep on inventing new forms by creating fresh combinations of these fundamental structures." So when we get round to combining these story types with plot structure, we can then talk about, when we've done that with the pure story forms, I'll then try and talk about how you can do it with mixtures of story forms. So that's the video. Just give a quick summary of what we've covered today. We've looked at Damon Knight's 6 short story types, and he talks more about these. You can find more about them in his book, Creating Short Fiction. I just looked before I recorded this video. You can get the Kindle version on Amazon for $6. So it's not expensive. You can be reading it in 5 minutes after this video. The story types are the resolution short story, the revelation short story, decision short story, explanation short story, solution short story, and unplotted in brackets illumination short story. So that's what we've looked at, and there's going to be a series of videos taking each of these and going into them in more detail. And in fact, the next episode is going to be the resolution short story, and we're going to look at that in more detail. We're going to look at the core elements, the key characteristics, when we're going to use this story type, and we'll have some more examples, and I'll provide some film examples as well, because I think film examples, I will provide some short story examples, but I think film examples provide a much more accessible range of story examples that will work for more people than sometimes the short story examples themselves. So until then, if you've got any questions, you can email me at paul@deliberate-practice.com, and I will try and get back to you if you've got questions or whatever. But the next episode in this series is going to be about the resolution short story in more detail, and I will catch you then.